Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join His mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.
Well, what an honor it is to have you on the show, Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join His mission. I think what we're going to talk about today is going to be hopefully displaying God's heart, challenging people to join His mission. I have you here with me today, Rebecca Nhep. Nice to meet you, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's lovely to meet you too. Thank you for having me on the show.
I'm happy you're here. We're actually here at the World Without Orphans Global Forum here in Chiang Mai, Thailand. I was honored to just meet 2 days ago, three days ago, right?
That's right.
You're the Senior Technical Advisor for Better Care Network, bettercarenetwork.org.
That's right.
Tell me more about that. Well, no, let's start like this. What is your greatest passion?
I think it might be hard to sort of sum it, bring it down to one particular thing or one particular sentence, but I am really passionate about seeing about this issue of children's care. Yes. I'm passionate about ensuring that children receive the best care that is in their best interests, that is child-centric in how it's both determined and both delivered to children. And that requires quite a shift in the way we're currently engaging with the whole issue of children's care, a shift in strategy, a shift in funding. And so I'm passionate about seeing that process of care reform take place, but for the end goal purpose of seeing children raised in families and seeing children really access the types of services that they need and that best meet their needs and their interests.
Okay, I have to pause you there and say, what kind of led to this passion? What led you to this point? You say you're passionate to see those children in homes in much better situations. I want you to explain a little bit more as we go along. But what led you to this point? Why did you gravitate towards this particular passion?
I had just moved to Cambodia. This was like 20 years ago now.
See. Oh.
And I was working in Cambodia and I wasn't going to be working with children whatsoever. And at the time I was actually doing a research piece, an ethnographic research piece. And I'd only been there for a few months, and there was quite a large orphanage in the country. It was probably one of the most reputable orphanages in terms of the government's perspective. And they called me one day and asked whether or not this young woman, she was a teenager, whether or not she could just come and flat with me. And she was leaving the orphanage. She needed somewhere to go. And I didn't think much of it because we weren't, our ages weren't that much different. And I just thought it'll be like having a flatmate, and that's fine. And said yes. And when she came and we became good friends and we flatted together, I started to see all of these issues unfolding in her life in terms of her ability to live and fit in with society, her, that deficit in life skills and just basic knowledge of how to function. And not only in her life, but she had quite a large sibling group, and many of them had left or in the process of leaving the institution. And it was unfolding in all of their lives as well. And it was just so obvious that something was happening. Wow. This wasn't just an anomaly. This wasn't just a one-off case. And so I started digging into, this whole issue and asking questions, looking for the research. And I came across the research and began to realize that my friend and her family really were a case study for what the evidence does show about the impacts of institutional care on children. And that kind of catalyzed a process that led me to go and try and find, okay, where are the options? Where are the family-based care services and systems in the country? And just sort of realize that we were at a point of time back then where reforms, were underway in some countries, were not at all being discussed in others. And I could just see that this is an issue that, it needs a complete shift in practice. And a lot of that wasn't just stemming from what was happening in the country. It was also stemming from the way churches in overseas countries were interacting with orphanages through volunteering, through funding, through missions programs. And that basically started a journey that I'm still on today of working in this space around care reform.
I feel like you just dropped 100 bombs on me, and we have to unpack each one.
Sure.
I could hear all these nuances in the story.
Yeah.
And I think you might have to articulate it for those who are not in this realm to kind of understand this catalytic shift that needs to take place. Just to reiterate, you're talking about a young woman, I imagine, who just phased out of an orphanage. Is that what you mean by institutional
That's right.
care?
She lived in a Christian-run orphanage in the country that had just over 100 children in it. Beautiful
Smallish,
facilities, beautiful grounds, attentive staff. And so it wasn't a bad orphanage by any measure. And yet here you had this young girl who, when she left the orphanage at around about 16, 17, just completely lack the life skills that you would normally develop in a family that enable you to cope when you're back in community.
So I think that's the thrust or the issue you're putting forth. Orphanages have accomplished a certain thing, but have we, okay, I guess here's the question. Have we created, or has a beast been created that we must feed to keep going, but it's not the end-all system that you would like to see in place?
Absolutely. Institutions are one type of care for children.
Okay.
There are other types of care, and what all of the evidence from over a 70-year period of time from all different regions across the world unanimously demonstrate is that institutions cannot meet children's holistic needs. And there are ramifications of institutional type care on children's development.
Wow.
And therefore, even though institutions are able to meet certain needs of children, they're able to provide shelter, they're able to provide clothing, they're able to provide access to education in many settings, food, but the environment of an institution takes away all of the things that develop in a child based on the family setting and the contact with caregivers. No, and so it's not a matter of making institutions better places. It is actually the regime of care, the institutional nature of care that has a detriment to children's development. Wow. And that is why we are, as a movement, both faith-based and in the secular realm, really calling for the end of institutional care for children, because there are other types of care, most prominently family-based care, that need to be prioritised, because we know that that's the environment in which those holistic needs can be better met.
So, for example, foster care?
For example,
and
foster care.
And the list would go on, I'm sure, much longer than that.
Exactly. Kinship care is the other really big one.
What is that exactly?
And kinship care is care in an extended family. So it's auntie, uncle, grandma, grandpa. It's, it might be a close neighbour, someone who's had a long-term relationship with the family, and that's all considered kinship care.
Okay.
And that can be informal, an arrangement just between families, or it can be a formal care arrangement as part of child protection systems.
It might be helpful to let everyone know that not every child who's in an orphanage or an institutional location is actually an orphan. Would you agree with that or not?
The statistics show us that the average across the globe is 80% of children who are currently in institutions have at least one living parent.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, now, what does that mean? It's kind of startling. The statistics are startling.
That's right.
And so, wait, why are they in an orphanage if they're not orphans then?
There are a range of different reasons, but the primary drivers, we call them, what is creating this separation event in a child's life, where a child's being placed in an orphanage or some kind of residential care, it is typically issues related to poverty.
I see. Okay.
Education is another one. So children from rural communities where education, particularly secondary education, may not be accessible, or where the quality of education might be poor. Parents may use institutions that are in urban centres as a mechanism by which they can get their child access to better education.
Okay. I could see how that might work. I'm not going to throw out a name of a country or a location because there are a plethora of them,
right.
But I could see you're in a rural area, the urban center where the children's home, the orphanage, etc., may be probably can. So you've mentioned a second ago that mission trips, volunteerism, kind of play into perpetuating this regime. You called it, strong word. I called it a beast. I guess that's, I don't know which one's stronger. Who's at fault here? When in doubt, blame the host.
That's
so
it.
I'll take that one. But so mission trips, volunteerism, these seem like pretty good things on the surface.
Yes.
I mean, we host mission trips at Within Reach Global, our ministry.
Yes.
We personally don't go to different orphanages, but I think many would say, let's do this. Ministry outreach, college campus, we'll go to an orphanage this day, ride an elephant the other day.
That's right.
So it's this kind of like adventure you're calling people to. You're saying that's hurting the children?
And the reason why is just like we talk about drivers from a family's perspective, what leads children to be separated from the family's perspective, the other set of drivers are outside of the family and community, and they are the source of funding and the source of resource that is being poured into institutions. And so orphanage volunteering or missions trips that visit orphanages, what we've noticed and what the evidence is showing us is it's actually creating a demand for for children to be in orphanages.
I see.
And oftentimes the number of children who legitimately require residential care is not actually meeting the demand of missions organizations or churches who want to send volunteers to support orphans and visit them and spend time with them. And
So you're saying there's churches who want to send more, but there's not enough resource or children in that position to visit.
And so in the middle, we've got organizations and we've got individuals who are noticing that there is a demand for this. There is a foreign demand for visiting orphanages, and that's incentivizing the separation of children from their families in order to be in the orphanages, to be visited and to be supported by foreign missions groups and tourists and volunteers coming from secular volunteering agencies.
If I didn't hear the first part of your whole statement just now, I came in halfway through, it almost sounds ugly enough to describe as trafficking. Had I come in the second part that there's this demand and foreign tourists and overseas visits, is it that ugly? You're saying, what is the remedy then?
Yeah, well, there absolutely is a phenomenon called orphanage trafficking taking place in the world today.
Wow.
It's been documented, it's been evidenced, and in fact, in a number of countries, there have already been prosecutions for orphanage trafficking.
Okay. I've never even heard that term personally.
Yes. And so it is now being recognized as a form of trafficking and as a form of modern slavery by a number of governments in their legislation that looks at modern slavery issues. And orphanage trafficking, like all forms of trafficking, is an issue of supply and demand and an issue of commodification. Now, it is not the missions agencies, it is not the volunteers who are trafficking children.
Okay, thank you for making that clear.
There are people who sit in the middle who notice that there's a demand over here, and that demand isn't a demand, it's an interest, it's a heart, it's a good intention. But the good intention is being commodified just as the children are being commodified. And you've got people sitting in the middle who are profiting from that. They're profiting from that by encouraging, or in some cases coercing, families to give up their children in order to bring them into these institutions, when they can then accept volunteers and accept child sponsorship money or donations, and it becomes a market.
I hear the good intention. I've heard that good intentions pave the road to hell. Okay, so I'm not necessarily saying a good intention is the best thing ever.
Yeah.
But I can see, let's say, the missionary community, for example, or those who go on mission trips. To me, particularly, a strong drive in belief, a belief in God, a belief in the better thing that we want to present, is the underlying motivations of many of these people. So good intentioned or not, I guess all that you're saying is very personal to me right now. Yesterday, I was with my daughter and wife at an orphanage. We just received the call that you can come pick up your daughter. We've been on a journey of adoption for 2 years now. And so I'm there and I see her. She's my daughter, but she's also surrounded by 200 other children.
Yeah.
And I wrestle with this thought, like, why her? Why not all of them? Will their parents come?
Yes.
Are their parents alive?
Yes.
I know my daughter's mother is alive right now.
Yes.
I know this.
Yes.
I'm wrestling with all these things that you're sharing with me, and it makes me wonder, how do you fix this issue?
Yeah, and the way we fix this issue is by actually reforming the whole system. The danger is that we look at it from a programs level and we say, okay, we need more adoption, we need more foster care, we need more kinship care, we need more of this service or that service. The reality is we need all of those things, but we need them all to be functioning as a cohesive system. So what we need to be doing is developing and strengthening child protection and care systems in each country. And if we do that, what we make available to every child and family is a range of services that can then be best suited to their specific needs. So if you come in contact with a family whose primary issue is poverty, rather than saying the only solution we have is to take your child into an orphanage, we can say, well, actually, we can link you up with economic strengthening initiatives. We can get you connected to the social protection, which might give you access to housing, to cash transfers, to other types of support. where
while
we find
the child stays
while the
in
child
their care.
stays with you, so you can
Yes.
fulfill your caregiving responsibilities, and it doesn't force a separation in order to access services. We might meet a child who does come from a situation of risk where there's abuse taking place, and that child may need to leave that family for their own safety, but that child can then potentially access foster care and still be raised in a family rather than being taken to an institution where, yes, the child might be safer, they may get access to some services, but it may come at the expense of developmental delays and a lack of life skills and a lack of other types of skills that child's going to need to thrive and function in their adulthood.
As in the case
As
of
in
your
the case of
flatmate
my friend.
back 20 years ago in Cambodia.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
so many children that are still exiting the care
Yeah.
system today.
So she might be the representative, the microcosm of the bigger picture that's happening. Can you take it from this, because you're giving me this 50,000 foot view.
Right.
Okay? Pardon my use of feet and
Yes.
yards. Should I bring it back to meters?
That's
I've grown
okay.
up my whole life in Asia,
Yeah.
so I feel meters and centimeters, millimeters much better than feet and
good.
yards
Yeah.
these days. Fahrenheit and Celsius, I'm not even going to go
Yep.
there, because nothing starts at 32.
No, that's right.
But so you've given us this 50,000 foot view.
Yeah.
Okay, that you can see the panoramic, the landscape. What can you bring it down to an individual? What is
Sure.
an example that you've seen or experienced that's really shifted the deeper passion in you for this cause?
In terms of the right response to a child?
I think so. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, what is the trauma that you've seen, or what is the delay, or what is the name of that one individual who makes you think, yeah, this is the cause that I want to trumpet?
Yeah, and as I said, obviously my friend was the catalyst for me wakening up to this issue and going, wow, there is something we need to pay attention to
Yeah.
here. But then as that journey unfolded, I met lots of different children. I fostered a number of children myself for quite a number of years who came from state-run institutions. And, one in particular who he is in his late teens now, he's an adult, and it's difficult because he did get to access a family, but the impacts of being a baby in an institution, which is the period in a child's life where those cognitive developmental delays are most keenly observed in children in institutions, he very much still struggles with a lot of those issues. And so, you can see these issues in him where he just struggles to connect cause and reason. And so he'll face issues in life and he'll make a decision, and then he'll get really frustrated with himself because he knows he's making a decision in a pattern, but he can't seem to break the pattern because the part of a child's brain that really deals with cause and effect and rational thinking and consequence is one of the parts of your brain that doesn't develop properly if you don't have a secure attachment with a caregiver. So you look at scans of children's brains and, where the areas of activity is, that's one of the areas that is most affected by institutionalization. And so, I've seen it in children that I've fostered. I've seen it in young people who have left care around me. And it's just very evident that this doesn't serve children's holistic needs.
Yeah.
And, in his situation, he was abandoned because his parents were unwell. And he was also unwell, and they didn't have the economic means to care for him and get him access to healthcare. So they thought the best thing that they could do for him was to abandon him at a hospital.
I see.
Under the assumption if they did that, the hospital would take responsibility to provide the healthcare that they couldn't provide. And
Which
so,
inevitably landed him in an institution or orphanage, yes.
exactly, as a baby for quite a number of years. And so, had the system that we just talked about been in place,
Yes.
we could have offered that family a different response.
Now, are you talking about Australia?
No, this is in Cambodia.
I see. Okay. So I don't want to put a number from 1 to XYZ of what country falls in the best scenario at present. But is there some places that are doing this better than others? I mean, what is a location or a system that we could point to and say, hey, they're along the right path, and we want to emulate this?
Yeah, well, countries are at different stages, and that's really heavily influenced by so many different factors.
Sure.
One of them obviously being the economic situation of that country. So countries that have, low and middle income countries that have had a strong history of aid money coming into the country, and in many cases that aid money may have been tied to particular approaches, including, large scale use of institutions.
Okay.
So they may be in a state right now where we're really needing to undergo the reforms, and they might be early on in their reforms, and so their systems are being transformed and developed over time. We've got other countries that haven't come from that history or background that'll be in a different position. So countries like Australia had a long-standing use of institutional care, but that was all transitioned. Care reforms happened in my country a number of decades ago now.
A number of decades ago, so you're talking 1970s, 80s, 60s?
Exactly. So we still, to my knowledge, had institutions in the 60s.
see.
We recently had a royal commission take place in Australia that looked into abuse in institutional care in the church settings. And they were looking into the church-run, orphanages and institutions throughout the 40s and 50s and so forth, where, in cases of abuse there. So Australia has already, gone through that process that we call deinstitutionalization. And now what we have, for example, in Australia is we have a holistic system. It's not perfect. There is no country that has a perfect system. We're always learning and adapting and changing. But they have a system where they have social welfare on offer for families who are, wanting to do the best by their children, but just need some support. That's available to them. We have family-based alternative care for children who need to be removed from their families temporarily or longer term. We have foster care. We have supported kinship care. We have domestic adoption. And so we have a better range of services. And we still do have some residential care. But that residential care is not institutional.
I see.
It is small, group, orientated care that is organized around the needs of individual children.
I see.
And that's legitimate, and that's always going to have a place in the system.
Yes.
But it's not institutional in its nature. It's not large scale. And so you don't see the same degree of detriment associated with that type of care. And that's kind of, not saying Australia is the model to hold up, but it's just an example of a country that has gone through that reform process, as have many other countries. And has come to the place where they do have a holistic system in place that can respond to the individual needs of a child and a family.
In any rate, it is something we could look to emulate, or say this has taken place here, it can take place others.
That's right. And we've got examples in Eastern Europe where reforms have happened as well. And we've got examples in Africa of where reforms have taken place, and there are quite strong systems in place. So we've got examples from a range of different cultural contexts that we can learn from. Every system needs to be unique. Every country, how they develop these things, there's going to be some generic components, and there's going to be very unique differences because of culture and things like that. But essentially what we all need to go through is that process of making sure we push away from institutional care for children, because we know that it is unable to meet their best interest in a holistic way.
Okay, I love that you're kind of breaking this down in many different levels. Much easier and palpable now than we started with big words and big ideas. I think you're making it relevant now. So here's the question. Let's bring it back to, let's even say the missions realm. I know you mentioned to me rethinking.orphanages.org.
Yes.
That's a partner organization of
it's
Better
a
Care
coalition.
Network? Coalition.
So it's actually an interagency. It's a cross-sector network.
I noticed there were tons of great connections and partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely. We have, organisations who are from the travel and tourism sector as a part of Rethink Orphanages. We have faith-based organisations and churches who are part of Rethink. We have charities. We have child protection groups. We don't have government as a part of the network, but we have a lot of relationship, and we work very closely with government in a number of countries through Rethink Orphanages. So it's a really broad range of organisations. It's a coalition rather than an organisation.
I like that.
It facilitates collaboration amongst a range of actors who all somehow have some intersection with this issue of tourism, volunteering, short-term missions, and the support of orphanages in overseas countries.
When you say that, it seems like those things. Now, if I was going to raise money for a missions trip, or if I'm a missionary living overseas and I want to raise money, I've been doing this for 23 years, in China for 15, and now here in Thailand. if I have something to do with children, right? Orphanage, underprivileged children, it's easy to raise money.
Yes.
That's easy to raise money for.
That's right.
Now, if I'm doing something like, leadership training or development or even reaching unreached people groups, which we do
harder.
at Unreach, it kind of takes away the face and the little life from this. You got an individual, you have a church saying, next summer, 2020, we want to take a mission trip to China, Thailand, Cambodia, wherever it is. What's your encouragement to them? How can they become learners, or educate themselves with best practices in advance?
We need to start to look at missions from an ethical lens.
Okay.
And one of the big shifts in our thinking we need to engage with when we're talking and thinking about what are we going to do, what does our missions program look like, including the short-term missions component of that, because that's an important part of it for churches. We need to shift away from thinking about what's good for the church, what's good for the team members, what's a good experience, what's going to catalyze people in our churches to want to give more, to stay motivated, to stay invested. All those things are important, but they're secondary. The first question is, what's in the best interest of the people we'll be in contact with?
That, as you describe it, is a true mission trip. Secondary, I would describe more as a exposure trip.
Yeah.
Right. And inevitably that many times is what we do. We don't really do mission trips, right? We do exposure trips. We're the one most at benefit rather than those locals on the ground.
Exactly. And so we structure the experience about what's going to be emotionally compelling for people who go.
Okay.
And that's why children become so attractive.
Yes.
Because children will stir an emotional response in somebody like nothing else will, particularly a child who is vulnerable or a child who's being presented as vulnerable. And so that makes orphanages a really big target for this type of missions trips. And
they're definitely more Instagram worthy.
Absolutely. And, it's quite ingrained in our Western cultures. There's a link we draw between missions and orphanages that's quite strong and quite long-standing. We have assumptions about who these children in orphanages are that sort of creates a narrative that says it's a good thing to go and visit them. And it's not that any of these people have the wrong intentions or are doing, trying to harm children. They're absolutely not. It's when something becomes so normative in your culture, you stop thinking about it critically.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's where we need to stop and look at missions and go, we need to think critically about this. Is this actually good for children? It might motivate our team. It might stir them to really give.
Yeah.
But is this good for children? Is it good for a child to have people come in and out of their doors day in, day out? The person who's feeding them and changing them and hugging them every day is a different person. Every week is a different team. Is that okay?
Yeah. When you describe it like that, I immediately, again, I'm in this adoption journey.
Yeah.
I was, this was 3 weeks back that I went to visit our daughter. Now she's almost 2, so she's a little bit farther beyond those children who are 4, 5, 6, and growing attachment issues beginning to form. Immediately, I see the same children all the time run, hug my leg. They're filling through our bags, and it's that new person. Now, if I was to spend a little bit more time with them, you could evidently see those attachment issues taking place.
Yeah.
They do this to everybody, and there's
That's
excitement,
right.
but can they really gel and attach with someone?
No, and they shouldn't be, because attachment needs to be fostered between a permanent long-term caregiver. And so what you're describing there, which is very common in orphanages and very common with orphanages that allow visitors in, is you see the children run up to you and they're excited and they hug you and they're friendly, they want to sit on your lap. And you can often look at this and go, wow, these kids are so happy. Yeah. This is evidence of this being great.
And I am the savior to them all.
Exactly. And what we don't stop and think about it from a child development perspective, or even reflect for those of us that are parents on our own children's behavior.
Yeah.
If my child was to meet a complete stranger, is that how my child would react? No.
They're
going to hide behind my leg.
Correct.
They're going to peep out and they're going to have a look, and then they're going to watch how I interact with this person.
Wow.
And after a little while, they're going to go, I think my mum's giving me a signal that this person's okay. So I might go sit next to them and draw with them or do something. And over time, longer time, that affection might come out.
Wow.
But it's never immediate. That's unnatural. That is evidence of reactive attachment disorders. That is not normal child behavior.
Wow.
But it's hard for volunteers to interpret that.
Yeah. I think when you take it down to the level of my children, our children, I think that's is it the bigger question here, the underlying motivation? Are we so ethnocentric maybe about, I guess the question is, do those far off children in those poor lands or whatever we want to say, do they matter as much as my child? Is my child, what I would do with my family, providing for them, are they more important? What's the intrinsic value of a human, I think is what we're getting at here.
Yeah, and connecting the dots to really stop and reflect. One thing we say to churches and to volunteer groups all the time is ask yourself the question, when you're considering doing something overseas, stop and ask yourself, would I be permitted to do that same activity in my own country, taking into account the skills I have, the qualifications I have, the amount of time I'm willing to invest in this? Would I be permitted to do that? Would I be permitted to turn up to a child protection facility in Australia and say, I'm here for 4 hours, I want to come in and hug the children? The answer is clearly no.
Yes, and I like how you point out your skill set, because many of the people that we are sending on mission trips clearly are it's a vision trip. They are the only ones benefiting. They're not qualified to do and accomplish the things that they're
Exactly. And so we need to ask that question, and then we need to ask ourselves the second question, which is, if someone from another country came into my community and did that same activity to my family, would I be okay with that?
Yeah, it sounds
would I
maddening
be okay
almost.
if a busload of tourists from, I don't know, Cambodia or Myanmar turned up at my child's childcare and took over providing care and teaching my children for that day? Would I be all right if that was happening every other day? I would not be okay with that.
Yeah.
So it's trying to bring it back and connect the dots again and say, okay, if it's not okay for me to do it here, and I wouldn't think it was okay for someone to do it to my family, why do I think it's okay for me to do that in somebody else's country and to somebody else's child? And again, it's just getting us to stop and reflect and ask critical questions and say, the most important question is, does this do the right thing by that child? And we can often say, oh, but they need to be loved. They do, but they don't need to be loved by a volunteer who's there for 3 days or a week. They need to be loved by a long-term caregiver. That's what's in a child's best interest.
But could it just be the James 1:27, pure religion or true religion is taking care of widows and orphans that's driving this narrative?
I think it is, but I think it's a misinterpretation of those scriptures. Okay. Because that's actually a passage that's talking about a vulnerable family. It's talking about a widow and her fatherless children. And it's a call to care for the whole family, not to separate the family or endorse a practice that creates incentives for separation. And so I think we are operating out of some of those scriptures, but it's, again, maybe we need to stop and really think, hang on, what does that scripture say? Yes. And put that back in the context of the whole Bible, the bigger meta-narrative. Does the Bible endorse this practice in the way I've understood that perhaps it does? Or is there a more strategic and a deeper issue that the Bible's encouraging me to look at here, which is justice, not charity?
Justice, not charity. I think you have single-handedly in 45 minutes destroyed every... you have disarmed many different assumptions. I think that's what you're good at doing, and you're challenging people. Maybe they're reconsidering many of the mission trips or their view or their outlook on these issues right now. With that in mind, where would you point these people?
Yes.
How can they learn more about what you're doing, your passion, or follow the organizations that you're working with?
Absolutely. There are some fantastic resources out there that have been developed specifically with Christian communities, with churches, with Christian organizations in mind, that can really help walk people through these decision-making processes. Around the whole short-term missions one, there is an online website and training that I was part of developing in my former role with an organization called ACC International, and it's called ethicalmissionstrips.org.
Ethical Mission Trips with an S.org.
That's right.
Okay.
And if you go onto there, it actually walks you through a decision-making framework. It has a whole bunch of downloadable tools that help you to, so it doesn't tell you, it's not prescriptive in saying do this and don't do this. It says, here's all the things we need to sit down and think through and determine to help us make a decision about what is ethical practice in short-term missions. So it just gives you a framework that you can then use to guide how you think about it, the decisions you make, how you invest, and then how you structure a short-term missions trips. From the what we do and who we work with, right down to the how do we make sure we are recruiting the right types of participants and volunteers who come, and how do we vet them so that it's safe for children if they've got any connection with communities overseas. So that is a fantastic framework.
Okay.
there are some great resources developed by Faith to Action, and that is a group out of the US, and I have the privilege of serving on their leadership council as well. And they've got some awesome resources, including summaries of some of the research. They've got case studies of different organizations. There's a whole range of videos that you can find on their website. There's an online training where you can find, a number of my colleagues, myself included, speaking more about some of these issues, and you can sign up and you can do that training. And they've also got a sort of a shorter resource on short-term missions and looking at that. So that's another really great resource.
That's Faith to Action.
That's faithtooaction.org, I believe.
Okay, if not, they Google it.
Google Faith to Action, you'll come up with it, and that's a really wonderful resource. So, looking at ACC International's website and resources, looking at Faith to Action's resources are some of the really good stuff out there. Obviously, World Without Orphans is another great platform.
I
think it's .org,
yes, okay.
And they've got a roadmap and a digital version of their roadmap that they've just released, which is a great resource, and you can filter it down by what where you are in terms of the vantage point. Are you a church? Are you at a local level or an international level? And it curates resources for you. So there are fantastic resources out there to help guide churches in thinking through some of these really tough issues.
I like that. Thank you so much that you are pointing those out. These seem to be the underlying motivations we need to give more attention to.
Absolutely,
because it's setting off for the great big world.
Exactly.
With all these good intentions.
Exactly, because we need to make sure at the end of the day, good intentions are a great starting point.
Sure.
But that is not sufficient to carry us through to the practice.
It doesn't have that longevity.
It doesn't, and it's not okay when we actually end up doing things that harm other people.
Correct,
to then turn around and say,
unintentionally.
I was unintentional. It was out of the best of intentions. We actually have a responsibility. The Bible talks about seeking wisdom. We have to seek wisdom. We have to be thoughtful in how we engage in this, and we have to recognize that our starting point in many countries in the West is a position of privilege, and we have to be very responsible with that, because it's very easy for privilege to become something that becomes very influential, but can also become, very harmful when it's not used appropriately and responsibly, unintentionally. Correct, in other communities.
And I think people have been talking about this for some time when helping herds and et cetera.
Exactly.
The list will go on in that
exactly.
Framework. But I would just like to say thank you for taking this time. I think your words and thoughts have been a challenge. You do draw on that more macro perspective I think we need to tackle. Rather than these micro stories, we're all an integral part of God's great grand narrative, but he sees the macro perspective.
That's right.
Outside of time and spaces of time and space dimensions, he can see the bigger landscape, and that we could just catch a glimpse of his heart and join him on that journey.
Absolutely.
Rebecca Nhep, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me once again.
Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join his mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed that video, leave a comment below. Tell me what you thought. Also, you might want to check out this video here, and honestly, that one's not bad either. Make sure you subscribe to Missions Pulse by clicking the subscribe button right here, and also click that little bell button so you get notified every single time we post a new video.